An Ethics Primer by Dr. Israelsen. So we're going to begin here by considering three basic moral questions. Moral philosophy, of course, seeks to ask and answer basic questions about the nature of right and wrong, of duty and obligation, of good and bad, so on and so forth. So three very basic questions suggest themselves. The first question, is there such a thing as right and wrong in the moral sense in the first place, right? Are we talking about something real here? Now, of course, people talk about right and wrong every day, but we have to kind of ask, if we're going to be thorough thinkers, are we talking about something that's legitimate, something that has an actual frame of reference? So that's the first question. The second question, what sorts of things are morally right and wrong, right? What actions should we do? What actions should we avoid doing? Finally, question three, what makes something right or wrong? Or in other words, what is the foundation of any particular moral claim? What justifies that this is wrong and that isn't, so on and so forth? What ultimate story about the nature of the world, of reality, of human beings, whatever, makes things such that they have moral qualities? Now, question two is what most people tend to focus on because it's the most sort of practical, but it is in many ways the least interesting of the three questions. Question three asks about the foundation of any particular moral claim, or the basic meta-ethical question of what grounds moral value. Meta-ethics referring back to whatever it is in the world or beyond it that makes it such that there are moral claims, right? We'll be spending the majority of our time this semester considering question three and how various answers to that question shed light on question two. So answering, question two in the light of question three, that's what we're going to be doing for the most part. However, as should be clear, questions two and three are only worth asking if the answer to question one is yes, or at least if we have good reason to believe that it might be yes, right? Because if the answer to question one is no, there is no such a thing as right and wrong in the first place, then there's no point talking about questions two or three because we've already determined that the entire field of morality is nonsense, right? So this presentation will accordingly focus on question one, and we'll try to see why the answer to this question is yes, or at least could be yes. So let's go ahead and sketch what we might call a moral spectrum, or a spectrum of views or answers to question one. Is there such a thing as right and wrong? Option one would be simply yes, there is such a thing as right and wrong, right? Now, of course, saying yes, there's such a thing as right and wrong doesn't immediately entail that you know the answers to particular questions of morality, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you have a moral doctrine on hand, but the basic idea or assumption that right and wrong are real things, we would call this position moral realism, right? Option two would be no. There is no such a thing as right and wrong. We will call the position corresponding to this answer moral nihilism, right? Nihilism is from the Latin nihil, which means nothing. So nihilism or nihilism is nothingism, right? So moral nothingism, moral nihilism is the view that morality is totally fictitious, totally false. Option three is a kind of sort of answer, right, which I'll be describing in more detail in what follows, but we will call the position corresponding to this answer moral relativism. All right, so if we have them on a spectrum here, then we'd have obviously moral realism and moral nihilism on opposite sides, with moral relativism somewhere in the middle. So moral nihilism might be defined as the position that morality is complete nonsense, and that no moral claims have any meaning, right? Morality is just a completely fictitious set of ideas and constraints that humans have come up with that has no basis in fact or reality, and hence has no real claim upon us. Moral realism would be the position that morality is something real, and that moral claims pick out real truths, right? Now note, as we'll discuss in what follows, that many different types of moral positions that defend moral realism are possible. Being a moral realist doesn't necessarily mean you're committed to one or another meta-ethical position on what grounds moral value. It just means that you think that there's such a thing as objective moral truth, that there are some things that are objectively good and others that are objectively bad. By objectively, I mean the opposite of subjectively. A subjective claim is one that's unique to me. So if I say vanilla is the best ice cream flavor, well, that couldn't really be objectively true or false. It's just a matter of taste. But when I say murder is wrong, I don't think I'm saying something like vanilla is the best ice cream flavor. I think I'm saying something that I take to be universally true, that it's a universal moral claim that's true for everyone, even if they don't recognize it. Moral relativism would thus be the position that morality is meaningful and real in a sense, but that what it commands differs from person to person or from culture to culture. So there are moral truths, but they're different for different people. So let's consider these different views. First up, we have moral realism. I have a picture here of Jesus delivering the Sermon on the Mount and Krishna teaching Arjuna about the nature of his duty and destiny. These are, the two central moral teaching moments in Christianity and Hinduism, respectively. So let's call moral realism the overarching view that there is such a thing as objective moral truth, right? And again, I just define what I mean by objective, that it's true for everyone, even if people don't recognize it. So for instance, if I say it is wrong to enslave people, right, I'm making an objective moral claim. And what I think I'm saying is not that I simply dislike slavery, or that for me it's wrong to enslave people, but that for everybody it's wrong to enslave people. And if you enslave someone else, you are doing something that is objectively wrong. You are incorrect to do that, regardless of what you may think about it, right? That's the claim here. So note that by real, I don't mean the same as physical, right? Nor do I mean that moral truths can be located through scientific investigation. Real is not the same as physical, right? There's a lot of real things that aren't physical. Numbers are real, right? But they aren't physical. They're metaphysical or, mathematical, in this case, ideas, right? Ideas of quantity, abstract notions. So by real, I don't mean physical, because certainly whatever morality is, it's not the sort of thing that science, physics or chemistry could ever discover. Science is in the business of describing things, not prescribing actions, right? As I put it in my other video, science can tell me what will happen if I push someone off of a building, but not that I shouldn't do that, right? So that's not what I mean by real. By real, I just mean metaphysically real in some abstract sense. Note 2. Other philosophers may well use the term moral realism in a distinct way from how I'm using it here, right? As with everything in philosophy, people use terms in different ways, right? So if you hear someone else using the word moral realism in an article or something, they might mean the same thing that I mean here, they might not, right? But when I use that term here and in the class generally from moving forward, I'll be using it as defined above, right? The overarching view that there is such a thing as objective moral truth, whatever form that might take, right? So again, we have here two distinct religions. Both of these religions are morally realistic. Hinduism holds there are actual moral codes, the same for everyone. Christianity holds the same thing, right? They're both moral realists. Are they both correct? Well, that's a different question, right? But they're both defending a morally realistic worldview. So, as I've said, any number of meta-ethical views about the nature of morality could give rise to a moral code rightfully designated as real. For instance, a divine command ethic, the view that God institutes real moral commands that everyone must follow. A rationalistic ethic, the view that reason makes manifest basic necessary moral commands that everyone must follow. A natural law ethic, the view that some fact or facts of human nature express basic truths that entail moral commands that everyone must, or at least would be wise, to follow. It's even possible to be a moral realist and be uncertain about the foundations, right? Someone may plausibly claim to be certain in a basic intuitive way that, say, murder and rape are wrong without having any story to tell about what makes them wrong. Now, presumably there must be some story there, but someone could very plausibly say, I just follow my conscience, I feel like I have a moral sense, I'm not sure what makes these things right and wrong, but I'm pretty sure that some things are right and some things are wrong, right? Now, we're going to be looking at theories that correspond to the first three. The last one's not a theory, so we're not going to look at a theory that corresponds to it because it isn't a theory. But the first three, we're going to be looking at theories this semester that correspond to all of these. We'll be looking at divine command ethic theories, rationalistic ethics in the form of Kant, natural law with Aristotle, right? So we'll see a variety of views here that correspond to a basic type of moral realism. In other words, being committed to the reality of morality does not immediately commit one to any particular story about what makes things right or wrong. Moral realism can thus accommodate a number of different views about the nature of ultimate reality, right? So a moment ago I asked, okay, so both Christianity and Hinduism, as well of course as Islam, really any of the other Buddhism, any major world religion is going to be committed to some type of moral realism, right? Now, insofar as they have different grounding metaphysical accounts, it would seem they can't all simultaneously be correct, right? Um, but again, my job here is not to determine which religion is correct. My job here is to determine what constitutes moral realism. And all of these positions correspond to a moral realism. And to the extent that these types of traditions overlap, right, we might say that they all express true moral claims, right? There's a reason why every major world religion has basically the same set of commands. Don't kill, treat others as you would want to be treated, because those things seem so basic and obvious that there's really no getting past them or around them. So again, for example, both Hindus and Christians are moral realists, though they disagree about the ultimate nature of reality that makes things right and wrong. Okay. So we're going to talk next about moral nihilism. But before we do, let's just talk about nihilism more generally, right? A nihilist in general, right? If someone claims to be a nihilist, this is a person who holds or claims to hold the belief that nothing matters, right? Nothing has importance. Not history, not the actions of human beings, not even their own desires or needs. None of these things matter. The world, the universe is simply a huge cosmic accident, and nothing has any significance whatsoever. So when taken to its extreme, a nihilist will attempt to claim the following. There is no truth, right? This would be perhaps the most extreme imaginable claim that a nihilist could make. There is no truth. There's a problem with this claim, though, right? To say that there's no truth, and again, when you hear people say this sometimes or play around with this view, I think it's quite common amongst young people who are kind of testing out their own mental powers for the first time, and they feel a bit rebellious, so they try on this nihilistic set of clothes. But if we think about it, there's a huge problem with saying there is no truth, right? Because we have to simply ask, okay, is it true that there is no truth, right? The nihilist is making a claim here, a proposition, a statement, there is no truth. Now, presumably they're making this statement because they think it's worth making, i.e. because they think it's true. But if it's true that there is no truth, then it's false that there is no truth, because we now have a truth claim, namely the claim that there is no truth. On the other hand, if it's false that there is no truth, which it certainly is, then truth remains. Right, the problem here is a basic logical one. You can't utilize propositional assertions in order to deny the validity of any propositional assertion, right? If you say there is no truth, you've made a truth claim. And if you're taking yourself seriously and actually trying to make a truth claim, then you've undercut your thesis. All right, so nihilism itself is conceptually incoherent. It doesn't seem as though it's going to work for these basic reasons. However, moral nihilism might be a view someone could coherently adopt. A moral nihilist would claim that morality does not actually exist. Nothing is either right or wrong, right? Now, again, they might not be making the basic logical problem or mistake here, right? Because they could probably say, there is no such thing as morality, right? That doesn't get them into the logical trouble that there is no such thing as truth makes. They're simply asserting that morality doesn't correspond to anything real in the nature of the world, in the nature of reality, right? So take a given moral claim, right, a very common one, that murder is morally wrong, right? Most people will agree with this claim, I think. Well, in general, as I noted a moment ago, any given proposition must have one of two truth values, either true or false. Right? Propositions can't be both true and false, nor can they normally be neither true nor false. Right? A proposition is either true or it's false. The moral nihilist, however, will claim that moral claims have no truth value at all because they are essentially nonsensical utterances. Right? They're just nonsense. Here's an example of a nonsensical claim. If I say the current king of France is bald, is that a true or a false claim? Well, it seems as though the answer is neither, because it's a nonsensical utterance. There is no current king of France, right? The proposition is poorly formed and thus has no truth value, right? If I were to say something like, green rises swiftly, then sinks into jealousy, Green rises swiftly, then sinks into jealousy. What in the world am I even talking about, right? It doesn't seem to be either true or false because it seems to be nonsense, right? The moral nihilist will argue that the same is true for any moral claim. Such claims are simply nonsense. Right? So the moral nihilist, when they hear the claim murder is morally wrong, they won't say that's false, right? Because to say it's false indicates there's some sense to the proposition of the assertion, and hence it can be accepted or refuted. They will say instead that's totally nonsense. The word wrong doesn't mean anything, right? It's just nonsense. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so such a view, the moral nihilist view, may be logically coherent, but it seems to me that it would be psychologically impossible for a human being to actually hold. Such a person, a moral nihilist, would have no grounds to complain about any conceivable action, or to prefer any course of action to any other. Right? Even seeing to their own interests, we might expect a moral nihilist to be just sort of an embitteredly selfish person, right? But even that would seem to be conceptually out of bounds, because that would be to implicitly adopt a moral perspective, that of ethical egoism, right? If someone acts in their own self-interest, they're saying there is value somewhere in the world, right? And that value is me getting what I want. But that's a moral position, right? So the moral nihilist, to be completely conceptually faithful to his or her idea, would have to have no interests at all, would have to give no preference at all to any possible course of action, but would have to view every action as equally morally indifferent. And again, maybe that's logically possible, but I don't know that it's psychologically possible. And, I certainly can't see why it would be desirable. Why would this be a position you would want to adopt? All right, so we've done a bit on moral realism and moral nihilism, right? So now we come to one that a lot of people seem to conceptually favor, at least initially, and that is moral relativism, or what I'm going to hear called normative relativism. Normative relativism holds that there are moral truths, but that they are relative, right? And they might be relative in, minimally one of two ways, right? Some people will hold a very strong version of relativism known as individual relativism, the claim that moral truths are relative to individuals. So, for instance, the claim X is bad would be, if a given individual finds X to be bad, they would say, oh, that X is bad, the claim that X is bad is true for me, right? But it might not be true for you. Well, I mean, look, people talk this way sometimes, but we have to wonder, does this make any sense whatsoever? Can a given claim be true for one person and false for another? Now, look, I mean, if we're just talking about the assertion of opinions, then we're not talking about truth claims. So, for instance, if someone says, I prefer jeans over khakis, right? Okay, fine, right? But that's a different claim than saying jeans are better than khakis, right? I mean, if they say I prefer them, yeah, of course, but it's not really a truth claim. It's an assertion of an opinion. It's an assertion of a personal preference, and that's different from making a truth claim, right? It would seem as though something can't be true for one person and false for another, right? That would lead us to the absurd position that murder might be okay for Joe, but not okay for Tim, because Joe feels that it's okay and Tim doesn't. Very implausible, right? Okay, cultural relativism is a bit more of a plausible view, and this is the view that moral truths are relative to cultures, right? And it seems initially more plausible because, right off the bat, cultures we recognize do, in fact, differ quite a lot on moral questions and moral matters. Different cultures have different moral views, different moral standards, right? Now, that's obvious. It's obvious that the different cultures have different moral standards. So we need to make a distinction here between descriptive and normative claims, right? If we're talking about morality descriptively, right, we're just talking about what people happen to believe, right? So here's a descriptive claim, moral claim. Hindus burn their dead, right? It's commonplace in the Hindu religion and most Indian religions not to bury the dead, but instead to burn them, right? It's a cultural difference, right? They burn their dead, whereas most Christian nations bury their dead. That's a descriptive claim. It simply says that something is the case, right? So descriptive relativism is obviously true. Descriptively, as a matter of fact, people believe different things. That's beyond dispute. But the claim here is more radical than that. The claim is normative relativism, and a normative relativist doesn't simply hold that people engage in different moral behaviors, right? they hold that everyone is right to engage in morality in the way that they do. Everyone's moral position is true for them, either as an individual or as a society. So a corresponding normative claim would be it is morally correct to burn the dead, or of course it is morally incorrect to burn the dead, right? Those are both normative claims, right? So think about the distinction here as follows. A descriptive claim simply states how something is. A normative claim is also called a prescriptive claim. It prescribes how things ought to be, right? Descriptive describes, normative prescribes, tells us you shouldn't do that or you should do that, right? Now look, when it comes to this question, the question of how to dispose of the dead, it's very likely that there is no correct way to do it, right? And this might be one of the many issues on which cultural moral disagreement is perfectly acceptable, right? So we can say, sure, it's perfectly fine if you dispose of your dead this way, we'll do it this way. It doesn't seem like something that I'm willing to or interested in getting into an argument over. What's more correct, burning or burying? I don't know. It doesn't seem to really matter. But take something else, something a little bit more morally loaded, such as the disenfranchisement of women, right? Now, there are many nations and cultures, descriptive claim here, that refuse to grant political rights to women, that don't let women vote, right? I mean, we were such a nation ourselves until about 100, a little more than 100, no, yeah, about 100 years ago, right? And many nations still do this. They refuse to grant political rights to women. That's a descriptive claim, right? Some cultures refuse to grant political rights to women. But here's a normative claim. These cultures are wrong to refuse to grant political rights to women. Or the converse normative claim, these cultures are correct, right, in their own way to refuse to grant political rights to women. Those are normative claims, right? Now, the normative relativist, again, has to be committed to the view that each culture is correct about their own moral standards, right? That we can't judge other cultures' moral standards. But that means that cultures who refuse to grant political rights to women are perfectly justified in doing so. It's their culture, right? And that doesn't sit well with me, right? I think that I'd like to be able to say, no, they're wrong to do that, right? They ought to allow women the right to vote. They ought to allow them a role in the political process, right? And if they don't do that, they refuse to do that, then they're wrong for refusing to do that. All right, cultural relativism continued. So given the initial seeming problems here, I mean, why are people so attracted to this view? Because a lot of people do find it attractive, right? And I think the reason is that it seems to promote tolerance and respect for other cultures. And tolerance and respect are good things, right? We ought to try to be tolerant when we can. We ought to be respectful of differences between people, obviously, right? Those are lessons that we've all learned. So it seems to promote that. But does it actually promote that, right? Is it actually promoting tolerance and respect? That's a question we're going to have to consider, right? And in an attempt to answer it, I mean, let's just consider a few possible problems with cultural relativism. The first problem is a very basic one. It's a basic logical problem, right? Let's suppose that we have three different civilizations, three different cultures. First, we have culture A, and culture A are cultural relativists. The dominant cultural and moral view here is normative relativism, normative cultural relativism. They believe that every country is correct, every people is correct in what they happen to believe. Then we have culture B, and these are moral absolutists. We'll call them moral absolutists type 1 of the first type, right? I don't have a theory in mind here, just of a particular type, right? Then we have culture C that are moral absolutists type 2, right? So, for instance, culture B holds something like this, right? The morality of absolute type 1 that we hold is the only correct morality, and every other type is incorrect. That's their stance. And culture C holds the same thing about their moral stance. Only type 2 is correct, every other stance is incorrect. Now, culture A, in holding to normative cultural relativism, has to defend the truth of each culture's dominant moral framework. So culture A says that culture B is correct, and that culture C is correct, right? But culture B and culture C are in contradiction with one another. It can't be the case that B is the only correct type of morality and everyone else is wrong, and that C is the only correct type and everyone else is wrong. Those are mutually incompatible claims, right? Not to mention that both of these positions conflict with the position of culture A, right? If B says only we're correct, that's obviously not only in conflict with culture C, but also with the relativism of culture A. So it quickly descends into logical incoherence. Not everybody can be correct. It can't be simultaneously true that murder is good and bad, right? It would seem to have to be one or the other, unless we're willing to slip back into moral nihilism and say that's all nonsense anyway, none of that means anything. So cultural relativism continued. The second problem, and one of the biggest worries, I think, is that it could be used as a justification for awful practices. If every culture is correct in its moral assertions, then nothing is morally out of bounds for any culture. Right? I have here a picture of the African slave trade, right? A very nasty event in world history, right? In our nation's history. It would seem that if every culture is correct, then we couldn't judge a culture for engaging in slavery, right? The cultural normative relativist would have to look back at the antebellum South in the United States and say, well, that was their culture, right? You can't pick and choose which cultures you attack and which you defend. If the view is every culture is correct in what they happen to believe, then that's what it means. And something like slavery, or the disenfranchisement of women, or female genital mutilation, which is a common practice in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, right? It's a horrific practice whereby young girls have their genitals mutilated so that they won't ever have pleasure when they're older and when they have sex, right? It's very horrific and it's universally condemned by most nations in the World Health Organization, but of course it's part of their religious tradition. So according to cultural relativism, it would be something we would have to say, well, it's their tradition, so we respect it. Child brides, right? In Pakistan, young girls are married off very, very young, sometimes as young as 10, 11, right? Maybe even younger. And this is, again, something that I think is pretty horrific and that we ought to be able to condemn and say this is something you shouldn't do. I mean, even something as extreme as human sacrifice, right? All of these things could have religious overtones, right, and often do, right? Many people, past and present, justify their use of slavery, their disenfranchisement of women, these sorts of practices through religious traditions, moral traditions, right? Can we not condemn any of these things as being bad? Well, if you're a cultural relativist, no, you can't. The third problem is what Mary Midgley discusses, the problem of what she calls moral isolationism. And this is a sort of, strongly related issue to the question of cultural relativism. Midgley attacks this notion by considering a closely related idea of moral isolationism, which basically holds that we cannot understand any moral culture except our own, right? It's just impossible to even understand their culture, right? But she lays out a lot of problems with this view, right? The first one is, well, does this work both ways, right? Is it simply that we are unable to, we in the West, in the US or in England, which is where Mary Midgley lives, or lived, she might have passed away. Anyway, does this work both ways? Are other cultures unable to comment on our culture? Because it doesn't seem as though most cultural relatives think that way, right? They're quite happy to accept the censure and blame of other parts of the world. They just don't want to give it themselves, right? Which seems to indicate a type of hidden superiority complex, as if we were so mighty and powerful that our words would shatter other cultures. We'll accept their praise because we can handle it, but they can't. They're too weak and they need to be coddled, right? That seems like a deeply insulting notion. It would also block praise of other cultures as well as blame, right? Are we allowed to praise other cultures for their moral practices? If so, and it would seem strange if we couldn't, if you can't understand something at all, then you certainly aren't in a position to praise it any more than you are to blame it, right? Things you know nothing about are things you can't form any judgments on, whether they're of praise or blame. And also just the basic recognition that it isn't true. It isn't true that we can't understand other cultures, right? It's a denial of a basic rational ability. We're all human beings, and maybe we can't understand other cultures perfectly. That seems plausible, right? That seems true, right? And that we should always try to avoid making hasty or uninformed judgments. That's also true, right? But the moral isolationist takes it further than this and says, no, it's just not possible to form any conception of another moral tradition, right? That's anywhere close to accurate. And that doesn't seem plausible, right? Human beings have a lot more in common than we have different between us, right? Across races, across gender, across political and social boundaries, right? We can understand one another. It takes work and it takes a willingness to be empathetic, to use our reason, but we can do it. It's not impossible. Finally, one of the last critiques she makes is to ask a question: do we live ourselves in a unified moral culture, right? And the answer is obviously no, right? In the US right now, we don't live in a sort of unified singular culture. We're a melting pot of a variety of different moral moral cultures, various traditions, religious beliefs, ethnic and national and so on and so forth, backgrounds, right? I mean, these are all part and parcel of the American makeup, right? Or from originally the British makeup, right? But if that's true, that would mean we couldn't even judge our own culture. We couldn't even assess our own moral beliefs, since there isn't a unified belief that we all adhere to. And that would make any moral progress impossible. And again, that would be to sort of hamstring our rational faculties, which is ridiculous. All right, so final thoughts here. The problems with normative relativism can be summarized as follows. The relativist wants to defend the existence of moral truths, but to reconsider them or reconceive of them as localized truths, right? X is true in this nation, false in that one, right? But this notion is simply incoherent, right? Truth is either universal or it isn't truth. There's no such thing as personal truth. There is personal opinion, right? But that's different than truth. Truth is something that is true across the board. That's what the word means, right? So the normative relativist is thus actually, it turns out, either a closet moral realist or a closet moral nihilist, right? These are the only two real positions. I think moral nihilism is a logically coherent position, and moral realism certainly is as well, right? Moral relativism is not a logically coherent position, right? Now, if we focus on the localized aspect of the claim, right, that these things are localized to various individuals or groups, then the relativist looks like a moral nihilist. Moral claims are simply expressions of group dynamics. They are social constructs with no real meaning. If we focus on the moral truth side, however, then the relativist looks like a moral realist. There are certain values that you ought to adopt, says the moral relativist, such as tolerance, respect, inclusion, etc. I certainly agree that those are good things, but if they are universally good, i.e. if they are the sorts of things that everyone should adopt, then the relativist is in fact defending the existence of absolute moral truths and is in fact a moral realist, right? If they say everyone should be tolerant, right, they're defending a view that everyone should hold, a universal truth, and they're a moral realist, right? So if tolerance, inclusion, and respect are only relatively good, i.e. relative to this or that culture, this or that group, then what could the relativist say to someone who rejected those principles in order to convince them that they should adopt those principles? The relativist says everyone's entitled to their own beliefs, everyone is correct in their own beliefs, and everyone should be inclusive and accepting. And then they find a person whose religion or personal beliefs or whatever says, no, acceptance and inclusion are bad, right? I don't have to be that way. What can the relativist say to them? If they say you should be that way, right, then they're violating the core tenets of relativism and telling them there's a way they ought to be. Right? On the other hand, if they say, okay, fine, you don't have to be that way because it's not for you, then they're abandoning any sort of claim to anything being good and they fall back into the moral nihilist side. So I think relativists are actually moral nihilists in disguise, or probably more often, moral realists in disguise. Again, there's something that seems initially plausible about relativism, but when we really start thinking about it, it falls apart, and we get everything we wanted: tolerance, acceptance, inclusion, plus the ability to actually defend certain types of behavior and condemn other types of behavior by adopting a morally realistic position. Okay, that's it for this lecture. I will see you next time.